combo on this. Maybe Peter a little bit on a little history and kind of give Buddha and Bruce a little history here. I know Kevin's been around and heard it already from us in the past. So.
Well, I guess what I would say is because we're kind of last figuring this out with our treaty rights as far as the MCT and Mississippi and Lake Superior, we've had to look at this a lot differently than the 54 people and the 37 and so forth. But as everybody knows, in the simple form, these treaties go back to essentially the Mississippi and the Lake Superior bands, and that's what the 42 treaty talks about, is that all the lands that have been ceded after 42 and the ones that will be ceded after that are all held in common by all of us. And so all of our rights really are interchangeable all the way across all of the territories. Even into the 63 with Red Lake and Pembina, they have the same kind of rights. They would have had the same rights in the other territories. And so as we've come to understand that, we started looking at other kinds of problems the gaps weren't being filled. We had a tribal member who's enrolled at White Earth, who's Mississippi, who lives in the 54, who got a ticket for fishing off reservation. And they cited him, and it took a little while, but working through St. Louis Court, they understood that we have the treaty rights for the people who remained in the 54 still have the right to hunt, fish, and gather also. And so they dropped that case. We also understand that the people of the 54 and over in Wisconsin have rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the 55. It's just where we live. And so that's why we've asked people here at the 54 to work on this, because the way the treaties work out, and Joe and I were talking about this a little bit earlier about when we relinquish all right, title, and interest. In the 54, Lake Superior relinquished all right, title, and interest essentially of all lands west of the 54 because they got paid for the 54 and the Mississippi didn't. In the 55, we relinquished all right, title, and interest, and that's because we had no other lands to sell the United States. But the 55 doesn't say the Lake Superior band can't come in and hunt, fish, and gather. It doesn't say Pembina or Red Lake can't come in and hunt, fish, and gather, because we're all Chippewa. And that's where we've kind of gotten goofed up on some of this territorial stuff. And so when we look at our treaties, we see that the 54 is most in common with us because these treaties are what we kind of call sister treaties. They're signed within 3 months of each other. They're both signed by the Mississippi. And the Mississippi didn't give up the right to hunt, fish, and gather. The treaty says those who remain have the right to hunt, fish, and gather, which are the human rights that we're talking about right now. The right to clean air, the right for clean food, those kinds of basic things. And so as we've looked at this, we see the picture of all of us being connected. And so that's in part why we're here to talk with the 54 or Fond du Lac, or we prefer to call it, because I know that there's a split there. And so when I looked on the website for Fond du Lac, and I've told other people, you guys have separate codes for the 54 territory and for the 37. At the same time, there was no provision in the 54 authority or in Fond du Lac codes for Mississippi members who live in the 54. And so when it came time for our guy to have charges, I don't know if they called the 54 people also, but basically they recognized that White Earther wasn't in the right spot, and then they ticketed him. And so we need to make sure we all are looking at this picture the same way also, because we all have these territories and we all understand that we all have these rights that are in them. And so we don't want to try to pretend that we're in these boxes because these boxes were created by the treaties and by the treaty drafters of the United States. And that's what we've been talking about earlier this morning, is all of these are boxes we've been put into, and we need to figure out our ways out of these boxes. So I don't know if there's more little history we'll want to tie to that, Joe or Peter, I don't know.
Right?
Yeah.
Could you, or Professor Erlander, for those of you that don't know Professor Erlander, he's did a couple wonderful position papers for us. I really prefer the first one he did, but he did get the second one published. I think that's titled the Blacks 37.
Yeah, it was 19th century usufructuary rights, the foundation for 21st century sovereignty, I think is what it was called, something like that.
Yeah, so, and I think, not to speak for Professor Erlander, but he talks about the importance of the 25 and 26 treaties and how, if we start, and I guess the best way he's explained it for me to understand is those that go to law school are 80-90% of law is property line. So when we're out here as lay people and we start talking about treaty rights, we spend more time arguing with the attorneys. But if we,
Yep.
talk the language of usury rights being property rights, suddenly attorneys start really understanding what we're talking about. So, the foundation that we're following is basically from the 1825 treaty and the 1826 that set the foundation for jurisdiction. So, I don't know.
Joe, did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
what I would like to say is that the 54 and 55 are tied together very closely. The 55, the Mississippis were party to the 54 and signed off, and there were some exchanges in it. And the 54, Kevin, you've already managed to be able to have a consent decree judicially recognizing. And we would like to tag along, and speaking frankly, just like to tag along with that same reasoning. Because the key difference between the two is that the 1855 does not include the reservation of the off-reservation gathering rights. And what it says, just like the 1854 says, is that all right, title, and interest is being ceded. Both say that. But the 1854 goes further and retains the off-reservation gathering rights on the property ceded. 1855 doesn't say that, but because it's all the same parties together, with the common understanding, and each of these were only 3 months apart, we think that if Fond du Lac would be interested in participating with this, it would help our cause. That's very boiling it down. There's a lot more details. And we've been using the same logic with the Public Utilities Commission here in Minnesota with the pipelines. And we got a lot of pushback at the beginning, a lot of pushback.
Does it specifically have to word in the treaty what can and what can't be done, what is granted and what's not granted? And does the reserve rights clause apply to every treaty that exists within that principle?
Yeah, there's a big piece that's being left out here, and that's the Millock's opinion in 1999. Everybody knows the Millock's opinion said that the hunting and fishing rights that were granted through the 1837 treaty were protected by both the 1854 treaty and the 1855 treaty. The 1855 treaty did not take away the hunting and fishing rights in the 1837 treaty. We can discuss what the exact language was in the 1855 treaty, but the Supreme Court said that the language in the 1855 treaty did not take away the hunting and fishing rights that pre-existed the 1855 treaty. Sandra Day O'Connor wrote the opinion in the 1855 treaty. All of the members of the Supreme Court agreed that the language of the 1855 treaty did not take away the hunting and fishing rights that pre-existed the 1855 treaty. Every member of the Supreme Court agreed with that. The reason it was a 5-4 opinion is that the members of the Supreme Court disagreed about whether Minnesota's entry into the Union and some other factors withdrew the hunting and fishing rights. But it wasn't the 1855 treaty. So as far as the 1855 treaty is concerned, the language of the 1855 treaty did not withdraw previous hunting and fishing rights. And Sandra Day O'Connor said, the reason we know that's true is because in the same year, 1855, those same treaty negotiators, the very same human beings, negotiated a treaty at the St. Mary's River in Michigan, in which they specifically withdrew hunting and fishing rights. And that language was not included in the 1855 treaty in Minnesota. So we know that that was not the intention of the treaty negotiators, because 3 months earlier, they negotiated the 1854 treaty. And that treaty didn't withdraw hunting and fishing rights. And the 1855 treaty, 3 months later, didn't have the same language as the St. Mary's Treaty. So the Supreme Court unanimously agreed that the 1855 treaty, the exact language in the 1855 treaty, did not withdraw the hunting and fishing rights that pre-existed the 1855 treaty in Minnesota. Following me so far?
Mm-hmm.
That's Sandra Day O'Connor. She lays it out in 3 paragraphs in the opinion. You can read it in my article. You can also read it in the complaint that we drafted in the lawsuit that we intend to file. She says it, not me, not Joe, not Frank, Sandra Day O'Connor, joined by a majority of the Supreme Court.
Can you say that whole thing again? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just,
No, I can.
no, I'm just kidding. I'm just playing with you. I have a. Oh.
No, I can say it again, and as many times as you want me
No,
to.
no, I'm just.
But, it's okay, I can play with you too.
What I'm saying, we have to have humor, okay? I was gonna ask a question.
Yeah, okay, well, let me just finish this
Okay.
little rap, and then we can both play with each other, because it's a very simple
Oh,
idea
my-
once you get there.
That's called Trumpy.
Okay. All right,
Don't
so
trump us.
if the Supreme Court decided in the Mille Lacs opinion that the 1855 treaty did not withdraw the hunting and fishing rights that pre-existed the 1855 treaty, the question is, what were those rights? Well, we know what they were in the 1854 treaty. Mille Lacs has been exercising those for years, or Fond du Lac has been exercising those for years. In the Mille Lacs case, the issue was, what were the rights in the 1837 treaty? We know what that was, because that was the result of that opinion, right? But there were also 2 other treaties that existed at that time. One was in 1825 and one was in 1826. Those are the sovereignty treaties. One treaty in Prairie du Chien, the other treaty in La Pointe.
No, Old Fond du Lac.
Pardon me?
Old Fond du Lac.
Was it Old Fond du Lac? No, I thought it was up north. Was it Old Fond, not La Pointe?
Yeah.
26 was on Fond du Lac. It was where Jay Cook State Park is now, right, Dale?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, it was in
Yeah.
Fond du Lac then. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I had that wrong.
That's okay, yeah.
And both of those treaties said that the Chippewa were sovereign in all of the territories north of the dividing line with the Lakota Territory, which is essentially north of I-94. And not only were they sovereign, they had complete hunting and fishing rights in all of that area. And if a white guy came in and did hunting and fishing, he gets prosecuted by the federal government. That's what the treaties were in all of northern Minnesota. So if we look at the 1855 treaty, which grants and upholds the hunting and fishing rights that pre-existed the 1855 treaty, it means everything east of the 1854 treaty boundary, hunting and fishing rights. We know the 1837 ceded territory, hunting and fishing rights. What about the rest of Minnesota, which is 1855 itself, and the rest of Minnesota, hunting and fishing rights? Who says so? Not me, not Frank, not Joe, Sandra Day O'Connor, and a unanimous Supreme Court. Now, what we would like to do is we'd like to go to court and have the federal court say, because of those pre-existing treaties that covered all of northern Minnesota, you can't treat the Fond du Lacers differently than Mille Lacs, differently than White Earth, differently than Leech Lake. These are all members of the Ojibwe Nation who were covered by the same treaties in 1825 and 1826, and dividing it up like this is wrong, and it's discriminatory against different groups of the same people. And it's not us that's saying this. Sandra Day O'Connor has already said it, and it's in the Mille Lacs opinion from 1999. And I'd love to show that to any other lawyer who has questions about it, and they can read my article that was published in the University of Minnesota in 2015 that lays it all out. So I'm done talking. Questions, and let's play.
I was just gonna bring up the point of a non-Indian person exercising the right to hunt or thinking they had the right to hunt on how they'd be charged in federal court. And that's what I was saying, because it does make it different. There is a clear defining issue with that, in principle with it.
Well, the people who have these rights would be people who would be, and this isn't for me to decide, this would be people who would be the beneficiaries of the treaties. And who the beneficiaries of the treaties are up to the native peoples to decide themselves, not me. But the reason it would be good to have help from Fond du Lacs is that they've already got experience in having negotiated a tri-band agreement initially, have had the experience of off-reservation usufructuary rights being enforced, and negotiating with the state so that the state recognizes full well that off-reservation hunting and fishing rights is something the state has to recognize in the 1854 treaty area. They have to recognize it, they should recognize it, must recognize it in the 1855 treaty area. Help from Mille Lacs, because Mille Lacs has already had that recognized in the 1837 treaty area. Red Lake has got their own rights because of the 1863 treaty and their particular situation. But the fact of the matter is that all Ojibwe people should have the same rights because of what the Supreme Court has already decided in Mille Lacs' opinion. So the 1855 Treaty Authority is actually asserting the rights for all Chippewa people. And understood that way, it's a common effort. I'll get off my soapbox now. The thing is, I want you to know, though, that I've been working on this since I was a legal observer on the boat ramps in northern Wisconsin during the Lakota struggle, 30 years ago now. And I started with an analysis of the 1854 treaty, and then realized how the 1854 led to the 1855, and figured out that doing this property analysis was a way to win in the white guy's system. And so this is not something that just popped up yesterday, so.
Good.
Yeah.
We're having a little discussion over here. What we're seeing is those rights you're talking about would be rights that are in the ceded territories like of 1854 or 1855, but not within, they wouldn't be addressed in, within the boundaries of your reservation, of your reservation. Those would be separate, they would have to be dealt with.
Yeah,
It's only in the ceded territories outside the boundaries.
Right, off-res.
Yeah,
these are off-reservation hunting and fishing
Off-reservation,
rights. Right.
because
This is-
when they were talking, I just had asked if it had any conflicts on our 1972 hunting and fishing rights agreement that we as a Leech Lake Band have with the state of Minnesota within the boundaries.
No,
Okay.
this is
Okay.
off-reservation.
Yeah.
It would be, the best image to think about is Fond du Lac situation off-reservation.
Okay.
Is that's the kind of situation that the rest of the,
So the state couldn't come at us, or the federal government couldn't come at us and use our current agreement within the boundaries and kind of go against us or challenge us on the ceded
No,
territories?
no, in
Okay.
fact, the federal government would have to back the, would have to back the tribe in enforcing the off-reservation rights.
Okay.
Because it's the federal government that the Chippewa Nation made the agreement with, and the federal government should be protecting those off-reservation rights.
Just this question, came up in my mind months ago when we talked about that case with the
Yeah,
fighters that got took over in 1854. They have an agreement with the state though, correct? And you get money for that.
No, we don't.
You don't get no money?
No.
Okay, but you do have an agreement?
No, we don't. We have no agreement with the state of Minnesota on our hunting, fishing, and the ceded territory.
The other guys do though?
Boys Fort and Grand Portage does, but not
Boys Fort,
Fond du Lac.
there's a story behind that, is that initially, the state of Minnesota negotiated a thing called the Tri-Band Agreement that included Fond du Lac and the two bands in the Arrowhead, where the bands leased the rights that the state recognized, the off-reservation rights the state recognized. They paid money to the bands for leasing the off-reservation rights that the bands had. And then Fond du Lac withdrew from that agreement, said, we don't want your money, we're going to manage this ourselves. So the bands are then in a position where they've got authority to co-manage the off-reservation rights with the state, or allow the state to manage and rent those rights to the state. And Fond du Lac decided that they didn't want to rent them, they were going to do it themselves.
How it happened was, the government back then went into this so-called agreement. The membership of Fond du Lac said, no, we're not gonna give up any of our treaty rights. They started a petition and going for a referendum, and that's what made the government of Fond du Lac pull out of the Tri-Man agreement.
Now, that was based on a case where I think it was the Grand
What year
Portage
was
band
that?
that brought the case, and I think there, and a settlement was worked out where this happened because the state was forced to recognize the off-reservation rights. This was kind of a follow-on to the Coudray cases that came out of Wisconsin. And at that time, the other bands in Minnesota could have pushed it and didn't. But the 1855 Treaty Authority is pushing it now. And this could have been done years ago, as you were pointing out.
25, 30 years ago.
Yeah, it could have been done at that time. But now what's happening is the Treaty Authority is now saying, okay, we want the same rights that are in the 1855 treaty to apply to us as apply in the 1854.
And 37.
And in the 1837. And the thing that is crystal clear about this is that the Supreme Court has unanimously held already that the 1855 treaty does not withdraw or eliminate the hunting and fishing rights that pre-existed the 1855 treaty. And when people say it's not mentioned in the 1855 treaty, they're right. But under the law, what that means is the treaty does not take them away.
Right.
Because to take them away, the treaty has to specifically say that the treaty does take them away.
Mm-hmm.
So not mentioning it means they're still there.
Yep.
That's what the law says. So if it
Reserve
doesn't
rights.
mention that it's taken the hunting and fishing rights away, I guarantee you it means they're still there. And that's what Sandra Day O'Connor said.
And that's where the state of Minnesota disagrees right now.
And the point, but it doesn't matter
I
what
know it
they
doesn't
say,
matter. I'm just
because
telling
the
you.
Supreme Court has already said the state of Minnesota is wrong about that. And it's not me that says it, you can read Sandra Day O'Connor's opinion. Boom.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanna add, and I don't wanna scare anybody away. Under that reserved rights doctrine, in the rights of occupancy of the 54 and 55. Our people through the clan system were much more transient in that era, where we have people now enrolled in Fond du Lac that were living in Sandy Lake or now living in Sawyer, living a little bit west of the 54 boundary area. And at the time of the 54 and 55, they understood, and I believe this, that they had a right to live the way they had always lived. And when they gave up the land, they still reserved those usufructuary property rights, I believe, in the 54 as well as the 55. What that means in the modern era, with the federally recognized Minnesota Chippewa tribe, I don't know.
Well, here, this is where, as I mentioned earlier, that when you can use the other guy's law against them, you do it. And what the Supreme Court law is that you must interpret the treaty in the way that was understood by the Indians. And if the treaty does not specifically withdraw pre-existing hunting and fishing rights, if the treaty does not specifically withdraw hunting and fishing rights, even if Congress passed a law, the law would not withdraw hunting and fishing rights. It doesn't matter whether it's Sandy Lake or what side of the river they were living on, or whether they thought they were Lake Superior or Mississippi, or it doesn't matter. The white guy's law says if the treaty does not specifically say we are removing hunting and fishing rights, the treaty does not remove hunting and fishing rights. That's the white guy's law.
And I guess what I'm trying to say to the Fond du Lac representatives is they have property rights in our 55.
That's correct. It's that they have the same hunting and fishing rights as Chippewa people all across northern Minnesota, as do Leech Lakers, as do White Earthers, as do Mille Lacs members. And it's not just hunting and fishing regulations. It means they have the right to protect the natural environment, i.e. pipelines, i.e. mines, i.e. the destruction of the natural environment all across northern Minnesota. The payments that are being made to the tribes or the bands in the Arrowhead,
Boys Fort, Grand Fort.
right? Those are payments that mean the state recognizes that if you interfere with the environment, it costs money. The mine that is being proposed for northern Minnesota, if there is an EIS for the entire Chippewa territory, which goes from the North Dakota border, actually beyond that probably, but we're just talking about Minnesota now, all the way across northern Minnesota, it means that every major environmental threat is going to have to be negotiated with the Chippewa. It means that it's going to cost somebody money to threaten usufructuary rights, the right to hunt, fish, and gather. And you talked about the right to have clean water, clean air. Actually, you don't have that right under the U.S. system.
Yes, we do.
Sorry, I said under the US system. You have that right as a human being. But the reason we have an Environmental Protection Agency is because the government has to do something to try and protect that right because it doesn't exist without a system to protect it,
Okay, I understand that point.
okay? This can create a system run by native peoples to protect that right. Because it means you've got now a claim that fits into the property context that allows all of the bands in Minnesota, the entire Chippewa tribe, to say that we have a property interest in maintaining pristine wilderness, that if we can't stop it, you're gonna have to pay us for making sure it gets cleaned up, like we're talking about with Route, was it Route 3?
Line 3.
Line
Line
3. Now, I would like to talk to the lawyers for every tribe in the state. I would like to talk to the RBCs of every band in the state. I would like to talk to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, because we can change the balance of power in the state of Minnesota to make sure that the promises of 1825 and 1826, which was you guys have sovereignty, into something meaningful going on into the 21st century, like my article said.
So where's those rights disappear from then, with the other treaties that came after that? Is it still there, or?
The land is still there. That hasn't been destroyed yet. The trees are still there. That hasn't been destroyed yet. The question is making sure it doesn't get destroyed more. And this is a lever, and Joe and Frank, because, you know, this is all stuff that comes from the white guys' law that they've been trained in, that I don't necessarily agree with myself, but it's a mechanism. It's a tool. Right?
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. And, but it's one that I think increasingly people are starting to recognize can be used, and those environmental guys that you talk to, I think, are starting to see it too. So, at any rate, that's the, and, man, you guys with this 1855 Treaty Authority have got a vehicle that is really, really powerful, probably beyond anything you've imagined. And if the Fond du Lac folks who've already got a system in place and have already recognized the power that the treaty, 1854 treaty gives you, if we can expand this to the whole state of Minnesota, holy mackerel.
It changed the world.
Change power, even better than changing law. So at any rate, I mean, my intention is to try and get people thinking about what's possible, because it's enormous if it can be done, and it can only be done by native peoples.
I'm a little confused. You say Saturday O'Connor Supreme Court says we have these rights.
In 1999, she said it, in the majority opinion in the Millox case.
Why don't we have them then? I mean, that's
Because they weren't talking about 1855 area at that time, Paul. They were talking about 1837, and the court only decides what's in front of them. They don't usually know more, but sometimes they decide more.
And it takes somebody to reinterpret that, to make it workable in a different situation. And that's what we're doing now.
And Punky, what Joe's talking about, not just that they weren't looking at the 55, Leech Lake and White Earth didn't intervene to be a party. If they had even been a party, they could have gotten relief. But there was nobody there to say me too. That's our problem.
Well, didn't the opinion also, didn't it just inadvertently already settle the case for 1855 when they mentioned it in the 37 opinion?
To us it has, to Minnesota it hasn't.
number one, Kevin, maybe Professor Erlander here should be invited on the 3rd of November. You know, he shows an interest in meeting with our RBCs.
I wrote it
and
down.
TCs.
I wrote it
I
down.
think, you know, I think, you know, that just would be my opinion. And the second item would be, Joe, what you mentioned, where the state of Minnesota doesn't believe that they kept those in there, those rights. It's clearly, Joe, and you understand that, Mr. Erlander brought it up, most of that goes to, when in the Michigan case, they took it out, it was in the language. That's the key there.
Yeah,
That's the
and
key.
Sandra Day O'Connor says it, and it's in writing in her opinion, she points to that exact.
And it's in our
treaty.
complaint.
You know, yeah, you bet. And
Yeah.
the state of Minnesota's not gonna, you know, they're not gonna entertain that until you actually get to that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Right, and they're probably not gonna wanna file an answer, they're probably gonna wanna make some agreement like it's written out there. That's probably what's gonna happen.
So I promise, unless somebody asks me a question, I'm not gonna say anything
Yeah, right.
more. And then my question is, my answer is either gonna be yes or no, so I'm done talking.
Okay,
I like
have a
I like
question.
hearing what you're saying, so.
I just had a question for you, Peter. Now, these, Supreme Court rulings, they can never be, appealed, I guess, for lack of a better word,
Overruled or whatever?
or overruled. I mean, they can never be taken back.
On something like this, the answer is no, because the comparison between the two treaties is already there, and you can't change treaties that are 150 years old. One says we removed usufructuary hunting and fishing rights. The other one doesn't mention hunting and fishing rights. And Sandra Day O'Connor says, here's how you do it, and they didn't do it. That can't be changed, that's historical fact. And it's historical fact that all of the justices agreed with her. Now, in a theoretical sense, it's always possible for the Supreme Court to change because they're human beings. Is it likely? No, in my opinion. But someone's really got to understand that opinion in order to give you a rational answer. That's why people get paid $500 an hour to disagree with them. And the state of Minnesota will pay somebody $500 an hour to disagree with them.
Yeah.
Well, we're blurring a few topics here, where are we at on the agenda?